I want to start today by asking you to step into a simulation. I want you to use your imagination for a moment.
Okay.
Imagine you finally decided to do it. You're running for political office. Let's say it's your local city council,
A noble goal.
right? You're fed up with the potholes, the rates are too high, you want to make a genuine difference in your community. But unlike everyone else running, you have a distinct advantage. You have a secret weapon in your back pocket.
And what weapon is that?
You happen to own the local newspaper.
I see the potential for mischief already.
It gets better. A few weeks before the election, when voters are really trying to make up their minds, your newspaper decides to publish a front page special feature. It is a candidate grading table.
A grading table.
Yep. It looks scientific, it looks objective, it ranks every single person running for office on their skills, their suitability, their vision for the town. And surprise, surprise you, the owner, you get an A+. You are labeled a top pick. Meanwhile, your opponents, they get failing grades. They're labeled the old guard or unfit for office.
And I assume the question you're posing is that illegal?
Exactly. Is that a crime? Is that election fraud? Or is that just, the beauty of free speech and freedom of the press?
If you had asked me this 5 or 6 years ago, I might have given you a theoretical answer from a textbook. But today, we don't have to deal in hypotheticals.
No, we don't.
Because this actually happened. And the answer to is it illegal is much more complicated and, frankly, much more disturbing than you might think.
It sure is. Today, we are unpacking the case of the 2021 South Gippsland Shire Council election and the controversy surrounding a man named Don Hill. This is a story that sounds like it belongs in a satirical novel about small-town corruption.
Right.
But it is very real, and it exposes a massive blind spot in our democracy.
It really does. And for this deep dive, we're going to rely on a detailed case file titled Don Hill, the Suspect. This isn't just a recount of the events. It's a forensic analysis of the legal and ethical breakdown that allowed this to happen.
And before we get into the weeds of Don Hill and his newspaper, we need to set the scene properly, because context is everything here. South Gippsland isn't just any council.
No, not at all. It was a council in crisis. To understand why this newspaper played such a huge role, you have to understand that South Gippsland had been without an elected council since 2016.
Wait, 5 years without a council? How does that even happen?
Well, the previous council was dismissed in 2019 by the state government.
Dismissed, like fired.
The entire council, yes, fired, due to significant governance failures, just total dysfunction. So for years, the community had no elected representation. They were being run by administrators appointed by the state.
So people's trust in local government must have been at rock bottom.
Absolutely. The 2021 election was supposed to be the grand return to democracy, the return of trust. It was a very fragile situation.
And on top of that, the region was suffering from what media analysts call an information vacuum.
That is a critical term for this deep dive, information vacuum. A lot of the traditional regional media outlets, the big papers that used to have a bureau in every town, had closed their doors or scaled back to almost nothing.
So you don't have journalists covering council meetings, you don't have reporters digging into the candidates' backgrounds.
Exactly. So you have a community that's desperate for leadership, they're skeptical of politicians because of the previous dismissal, and they're lacking reliable, independent news sources to tell them who's who.
It sounds like the perfect storm for someone to step in and control the narrative.
It was. And into that storm walks a candidate who also happens to own the news.
Which brings us to the core of this. We are looking at a case that forces us to ask, how can a candidate legally own the news outlet covering their own election? Why couldn't the laws stop it? And frankly, is this a structural blind spot that could affect any town in the country as local news dies out?
That's the mission today. We aren't here to relitigate the election results or just bash one guy. We're here to look at the system that allowed it.
So let's introduce the players. We've mentioned Don Hill.
Right, Don Hill. He's a former mayor, a well-known figure in the area, a local businessman, so he's not a newcomer. And his wife, Barbara Hill.
And together, they launched a venture, a newspaper.
Correct. South Gippsland Voices, founded in early 2020. It positioned itself as a new local newspaper, specifically to fill that vacuum we talked about.
A noble cause on the surface.
On the surface, yes. And right from the start, the corporate structure is, well, it's interesting. Don Hill served as the director of the company. But he wasn't just a silent investor. He was also the head of advertising.
Okay, so he's running the business side. He's the guy out there selling the ads, shaking hands with local businesses, bringing in the revenue. That puts him right in the thick of the community's commerce.
It does. And speaking of commerce, there's a financial detail here that adds a layer of legitimacy to the paper. South Gippsland Voices received $60,000 in Victorian government advertising funding.
$60,000 from the government. That's not pocket change for a local startup paper.
It's significant. Now, to be fair, we have to be precise. This money was part of a broader program. It was intended for public health messaging and regional media support during the pandemic. Think COVID-19 updates, stay safe messaging, that sort of thing.
So it wasn't a political grant. It wasn't, here's money to start a political paper.
No, absolutely not. But functionally, it meant a media outlet owned by a future candidate was being sustained in part by significant taxpayer money.
It signals to the reader, this is a real newspaper. The government advertises here. It buys credibility, doesn't it?
It buys a huge amount of credibility. It makes it look official.
So the paper is up and running. It has some government money. Then we fast forward to the 2021 election. Don Hill decides, I'm running for council. What happens to his role at the paper? Because surely you can't be the editor and the candidate at the same time. Even I know that.
Well, this is what we call the election pivot. When the election rolled around and Don announced his candidacy, he did step down as editor.
Okay, so he recused himself. On the surface, that sounds responsible. I'm running, so I'm stepping back.
It sounds responsible.
Yeah.
But he stepped down as editor after his candidacy was public. And here's the catch. He remained the director. He remained the head of advertising.
He's still on the company.
He still owned the company. And the big question is, who took over editorial control? Who became the gatekeeper of the news coverage?
I have a feeling I know the answer.
His wife, Barbara Hill.
Okay, so let's unpack the optics of that. You step down to avoid a conflict of interest, but you hand the keys to your spouse, and you're still in the office handling the ad revenue.
It creates a situation where the separation between the campaign and the newsroom is, well, porous at best.
Porous is a polite word for it.
It's a family affair. And while that might be fine if you're running a corner bakery, I'll bake the bread, you sell it, it gets very complicated when you're talking about the Fourth Estate and democratic elections. The firewall between editorial and advertising is supposed to be sacred in journalism.
And here, it was a dinner table conversation.
Precisely.
And this wasn't just them running puff pieces about community gardens or generic get-out-and-vote articles. They published something very specific that caused a huge uproar.
They did. This is the centerpiece of the controversy. This is the smoking gun, if you will. It was called the candidate grading table.
I love a good chart. I really do.
Yeah.
But in an election, this sounds dangerous. Paint the picture for me. What did this table look like?
It purported to be a helpful guide for confused voters. Remember, there's an information vacuum. Voters don't know who these people are, so the paper provides a service.
We're here to help you decide.
We've done the homework for you. It ranked candidates on their skills, their experience, their suitability for office. It used a scoring system. It had categories. It looked very methodical.
And how did the director of advertising, Don Hill, score on this objective table produced by his own company and edited by his wife?
He did remarkably well, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Don Hill and 3 of his allied candidates were labeled top picks. They were described as progressive independents. They had high marks across the board.
Progressive independence. Sounds very electable. And everyone else, his rivals.
Well, the other candidates were ranked poorly. They were labeled the old guard. They were given low scores on suitability. And here's a critical methodological issue that came out later in the complaints.
What's that?
Some of those candidates weren't even contacted for a response prior to being graded.
So they wake up, grab their morning coffee, open the local paper, and see they've been given a D-minuses and labeled unfit without ever being asked a single question.
Essentially, they were judged in absentia by their opponent's newspaper. It presented itself as journalism. Here's our analysis. But it functioned very much like campaign material.
It was a hit list disguised as a report card.
That's a very good way to put it.
Now, you mentioned allied candidates. Was this just Don Hill liking these people, or was there more to it? Because usually if you're running for office, everyone else is the enemy.
There was more. And this came out during the investigation by the inspectorate. There was a specific cost-sharing arrangement.
What does that mean in this context?
Don Hill and 3 other candidates shared the costs for how to vote mail-outs. These are the flyers you get in your letterbox telling you how to number the boxes on your ballot.
Okay, so they're working together.
Now, in isolation, candidate sharing costs is a common thing in Australian politics. It saves money. You split the printing bill. They deny that this was an inducement or that anyone was getting free advertising in exchange for anything.
What?
But if you look at the candidate grading table in the newspaper,
Let me guess. The four people splitting the bill were the four people who got the best grades.
It is quite the coincidence, isn't it? The four candidates in the cost-sharing group were the exact same four candidates ranked highest by the newspaper's editorial content.
I mean, if I'm a voter reading that, I'm thinking, wow, these four people must really be the cream of the crop. I wouldn't necessarily know they're splitting the bill for mailers behind the scenes.
You'd have no way of knowing.
I'm just trusting the independent newspaper.
And that is exactly where the outrage comes from. It's the blending of commercial interests, political alliance, and editorial endorsement, all hidden under the banner of community news.
So naturally, people complain, this feels like it breaks every rule in the book. You can't just do that, right?
People certainly trying to stop it. Two rival candidates and a member of the public lodged formal complaints with the local government inspectorate, or the LGI. That's the watchdog for local council elections.
And what were they alleging specifically? Was it just, this feels wrong?
The complaints focused on three main pillars: misleading election material, lack of disclosure, and editorial bias. Basically, they argue that this wasn't a newspaper anymore. It was a propaganda pamphlet disguised as news.
Okay, and this brings us to the ethics of journalism. Before we get to the law, let's just talk about the ethics. There has to be a code against this.
Oh, there is. The MEA, that's the Media, Entertainment, and Arts Alliance, has a journalist code of ethics. It is very clear. It explicitly requires disclosure of conflicts and the protection of editorial independence.
What does it say?
I mean, the first point is honesty, fairness, independence. It says, do not allow personal interest or any belief, commitment, payment, gift, or benefit to undermine accuracy, fairness, or independence. It's journalism 101.
So how did the Hills defend this? Did they just say, we don't care about the code?
No, they had a defense. And it's a clever one, in a way. The Hills maintained that the paper operated with editorial independence. They argued that because Don stepped down as editor and Barbara was running the show, there was a separation.
The dinner table firewall.
Exactly. Yeah. But they also made a broader argument, which is where it gets interesting. They argued that newspaper endorsements and opinions are standard puncts of democracy.
Yeah, and they are, right?
They are. Think about it. The New York Times endorses candidates for president. The local Gazette endorses the mayor. Why can't South Gippsland Voices have an opinion? That was their argument.
But the publisher of the New York Times isn't usually the guy running for president. That's the difference.
Precisely. That's the distinction they glossed over. The ownership structure, Don as director and the editorial succession, Barbara as editor, created what the case file calls a perceived and arguable actual conflict.
Perceived and actual.
But, and this is the big but that drives this whole story, ethical codes are voluntary. They aren't laws. You can't go to jail for breaking the journalist code of ethics. You might get kicked out of the union, but that's about it.
So you can be unethical but still legal.
That is the defining theme of this entire deep dive. Lawful but awful, as some might say.
Okay, let's get into the legal deep dive then, because I'm sitting here thinking, surely there is a law that says you can't use your own newspaper to grade yourself an A and your opponent an F. Why wasn't this illegal?
This is where we have to look at the Victorian electoral law, specifically the Local Government Act 2020. And this is where things get really frustrating for people who believe in fairness.
I'm ready to be frustrated.
The Act regulates campaign material. It regulates candidate conduct. But it does not explicitly prohibit candidates from owning media outlets.
It's a gap.
It's a chasm. Our source material, the case file, it breaks this down into 5 thresholds of legality. We can walk through each one to see how the conduct in this case managed to skirt the law, point by point. It's like a masterclass in exploiting loopholes.
Let's do it. I want to see how this magic trick was performed. Threshold number 1, election material authorization.
Right. So the law says that any election, material flyers, ads, posters, anything intended to influence a vote must state who authorized it. You've seen this on flyers. Authorized by John Smith, 123 Main Street.
Yeah, the fine print at the bottom that nobody reads.
Right, but it's there for a reason. The purpose is accountability. You need to know who is responsible for the message. In the case of the candidate grading table, it was authorized.
By who? Don Hill.
By Barbara Hill.
His wife.
His wife. So technically, it had a name and an address on it.
So it met formal compliance.
Exactly. The law cares that it is authorized. It doesn't necessarily forbid the candidate's wife from being the authorizer, as long as her name and address are there.
So even if the voter doesn't realize Barbara is Don's wife, or that Don owns the paper. As long as Barbara Hill is printed at the bottom, the law says, good job, you've complied.
Correct. It's a loophole of context. The authorization is there, but the significance of that authorization might be lost on the average voter. The law checks the box, but the voter misses the connection.
That's incredible. Okay. Threshold number 2, misleading or deceptive material. Now, this one feels like it should have stuck. If I say I am the best candidate and you are the worst, and I dress it up in a scientific-looking table, isn't that misleading?
You would think so. The law says you cannot mislead or deceive voters' understanding of facts. But here's the catch. The table claimed to be a guide only, and it used scoring.
But scoring implies objectivity. I got a 9 out of 10, you got a 2 out of 10. That looks like a fact. It's math.
It looks like math, but legally it falls into the realm of opinion. And opinion is protected speech.
So it's like a movie review. I give this candidate 1 star.
Precisely. That's the defense. To be illegal, to be found misleading or deceptive under the Act, a reasonable voter would have to mistake the opinion for objective fact and be materially misled by it.
Who is this reasonable voter? Is that me? Is that my neighbor who believes everything they read on Facebook?
That's the million-dollar question in law. The court set the bar for the reasonable voter very high. Basically, the law assumes the voter is skeptical, intelligent, and can tell the difference between a newspaper's opinion and a certified government fact.
So if the paper says, we think Don is great, the law assumes I'm smart enough to say, well, that's just their view. Even if they put it in a chart that looks like a government report.
Yes.
Ugh.
Unless they published a specific lie, like saying an opponent had a criminal record when they didn't, or that they voted a certain way when they didn't, it's very hard to cross that threshold. The grading table was weak, it was biased, it was subjective, but it wasn't factually false in a way that triggers the Act. It was puffery.
Puffery. That's a great word for legal nonsense. Okay. Threshold 3, disclosure of associations. Surely you have to disclose that you own the paper, that you're married to the editor.
You would have to disclose connections if it was considered campaign advertising.
But
this was framed as a newspaper article. It was editorial content. And Victorian law doesn't require proactive disclosure of ownership interests or family relationships in news articles.
that is wild. So because they called it news and not an ad, they don't have to say, by the way, the candidate owns this company and is married to the editor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It dodged the requirement entirely. If Don had taken out a full-page ad in his own paper saying, vote for Don, he would have had to authorize it as his campaign. But if his wife writes an article saying, we think Don is the best, no disclosure of their relationship is legally required. It exploits the definition of news.
That is a massive, massive loophole. Okay, threshold 4, improper use of resources. We talked about that $60,000 in government ad money. This one makes my blood boil a little. Taxpayer money going to this paper.
It's the one that usually gets people the most riled up. It just feels wrong.
It does.
But legally, you have to follow the money trail. The finding by the inspectorate was that the money was for public health and COVID messaging. It wasn't for the campaign.
But money is fungible, isn't it? If a government gives you $60,000 to keep the lights on and pay the printer for COVID ads, that frees up $60,000 of your own money to spend on mailers or other things.
That's the economic reality. But the legal reality requires proof of a direct breach. Unless it could be proven that the government money directly paid for the printing of the candidate grading table, or that the government's decision to place the ads there was contingent on political alignment, no breach occurred.
And you can't prove that.
It's almost impossible to prove. So it looks bad, the optics are terrible, but looking bad isn't illegal.
Okay, this is getting depressing. Finally, threshold 5, inducements. This is the cost-sharing thing, the I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine alliance.
The concern here was the potential for preference swapping. I'll rank you high in my newspaper if you tell your supporters to rank me high on the ballot.
A quid pro quo.
Right. But again, cost sharing is allowed if costs are genuinely shared.
So if they all actually wrote a check for 25% of the printing bill, it's legal.
Yes. Without proof of a hidden benefit, like getting free ads in the newspaper in exchange for preferences, it stands up. The LGI found no evidence that the positive newspaper coverage was a payment for the political alliance. It was just a coincidence.
A very, very convenient coincidence.
So when you sum it all up, when the LGI looked at all 5 of these potential breaches, they came to the same conclusion for each one. The legal assessment of the conduct was weak but lawful.
Weak but lawful. That should be the title of the biography. It really highlights the problem, doesn't it? The core issue here isn't about rogue behavior. It's not that Don Hill broke the rules and got away with it.
No.
It's that he followed the rules and the results still felt profoundly wrong and unfair.
It's a governance gap. That's what the case file calls it.
For you.
We have laws for candidates. We have laws for newspapers, sort of like defamation and so on. But we don't have laws for the intersection.
Right. The Venn diagram of candidate and publisher used to be two separate circles. Now they can overlap, and there's nothing in the middle.
And the current laws do not regulate that intersection. They're written for a different era.
An era where, what? The local paper was owned by a giant faceless corporation.
Yes, or a wealthy family that saw themselves as civic custodians and stayed out of direct politics. But look at the modern context. As we discussed, regional newsrooms are dying. Big players are pulling out.
Leaving that information vacuum.
And who fills it? Small, local outlets, hyper-local news websites, community Facebook pages, blogs. And often these are run by people who are active political players. They're passionate about their community, so they start a news page. Then they decide to run for council.
And suddenly you have a 20th century electoral framework trying to manage 21st century influence mechanisms.
That's it exactly. The law is a horse and buggy, and the problem is a sports car.
And the consequence is trust. That's what gets damaged here.
Trust is the victim. Even if everything done was technically lawful, the perceived legitimacy of the election takes a massive hit. If voters feel the game is rigged, they stop playing. Or they become cynical and disengaged.
Which is exactly what South Gippsland didn't need.
It's the last thing they needed. The issue is whether democratic processes were meaningfully protected. In South Gippsland, given the history of dismissal, that protection was vital and the system failed to provide it.
So we've identified the problem. The car has no brakes. How do we fix it? The source material proposes a targeted law reform package. And I like that word, targeted.
Yes, and what I like about these reforms is that they try to thread a very difficult needle. They want to close this gap without killing free speech. You don't want to say newspaper owners can never run for office.
No, that's not democratic either.
Right. You shouldn't be banned from civic duty just because you own a business. The goal is transparency, not prohibition.
True. So let's walk through the solution. What's reform number one?
Reform one is beautifully simple. It's called Election Period Media Conflict Disclosure.
Disclosure.
Just simple, clear disclosure. The rule would be, if a candidate owns or controls a media outlet or has a close family member in editorial control, this must be prominently disclosed in every single piece of election-related content.
So no more hiding behind the editorial label. You can't bury it in the fine print.
No, right at the top of the article, at the bottom of the grading table. A clear, easy-to-read disclaimer. This content was published by a newspaper owned by candidate X, or the editor of this publication is the spouse of candidate Y.
It eliminates the ambiguity. The voter can still read it, they can still make their own mind up, but they know where it's coming from. It's like a nutritional label for news.
That's a perfect analogy. It informs the voter without censoring the publisher.
What's reform number two? This one sounded a bit more technical in the outline.
It is a bit more legalistic, but very powerful. It's called the editorial independence safe harbor, or a rebuttable presumption.
Rebuttable presumption. That sounds like lawyer speak. Break it down for us.
Okay. Currently, the burden of proof is on the complainer, the person filing the grievance, to prove the paper isn't independent.
Which is hard to do.
Almost impossible. This reform flips it. If a candidate has a material interest in the paper, the content is presumed not to be independent.
Oh, wow. So you're guilty until proven innocent? The default setting is, this is biased.
In terms of independence, yes. The outlet then has the opportunity to rebut that presumption. They have to prove they have a genuinely independent editor, that they have a public charter of independence, that there are real firewalls, that the candidate has no involvement. If they can prove that, they get the safe harbor.
And if they can't?
If they can't prove it, they get slapped with the not independent label, and that would have to be disclosed.
That shifts the power dynamic completely. It forces the outlet to build real walls between the candidate and the newsroom if they want to be taken seriously.
Correct. It incentivizes good behavior.
Okay, reform number three. This one addresses the grading table specifically.
Yes. The evaluative election content classification.
Catchy name.
The idea is to create a new legal category for content that ranks, scores, or grades candidates. If you are going to publish something that looks like a report card, it comes with special rules.
And what are those rules?
You must disclose your methodology, What criteria did you use? How did you weight them? You have to say who the author is. And, crucially, you have to state whether the candidates who were graded were given a right of reply.
So you can't just pull grades out of thin air. You have to show your work.
Correct. It doesn't ban the ranking, but it demands transparency about how the ranking was created. If you gave someone a D, you have to explain why, and you have to prove you at least tried to ask them for their side of the story.
That seems like just basic fairness.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Reform number 4 deals with the money, the $60,000.
The public funding neutrality rule. This one is straightforward. Government advertising money cannot be placed in outlets owned or controlled by candidates during a declared election period. Full stop. Unless strict provable separation exists, like under that safe harbor rule we just talked about.
This stops the optics of the government subsidizing a campaign.
Exactly. It prevents the taxpayer from inadvertently funding a candidate's mouthpiece, which, even if it's not illegal now, just looks terrible and undermines public trust in both the government and the media.
And finally, reform number 5, because one of the big problems here was that by the time the complaints were heard, the election was long over, the damage was done.
This is the real-time electoral remedy power. This might be the most important one. Currently, enforcement is reactive. An investigation takes months. This reform would empower the inspectorate, the LGI, to issue interim corrective notices before voting day.
So they could step in and say, stop.
Or, more likely, you need to print a retraction in tomorrow's paper. Or you need to add a disclosure to that article on your website immediately. It allows for a referee on the field blowing the whistle during the game rather than a judge reviewing the tape 6 months later when it doesn't matter anymore.
I like that. It actually gives the rules some teeth in real time.
It does. And to show how these reforms would work in practice, the source material walks us through a hypothetical media candidate influence test, a sort of checklist for the regulator.
Let's do it. Let's put Don Hill's case through this new test. Let's see if he passes under the new rules.
Okay, step 1 of the test. Threshold trigger. Is there a candidate with an interest in a media outlet?
Yes, Don Hill and South Gippsland Voices. Easy.
Step 2. Material interest. Does a candidate own or control it? Or does a family member?
Yes, he's the director and owner. His wife is the editor. Check.
Step 3. Content influence. Did the outlet publish evaluative content, like rankings or scores?
Yes, the candidate grading table. That's a big check.
Now, step 4. Independence rebuttal. Can the outlet prove total operational separation?
Well, his wife is the editor and he's the ad director and owner.
Oh,
I'm going
no.
to go with no. That would be a very hard sell.
Extremely hard. The spousal connection and his active role in advertising make it very difficult to prove total separation. They would almost certainly fail this step.
So what happens then?
Well, the test moves to step 5, voter impact. Would a reasonable voter attribute unwarranted credibility to the content because it's presented as news from a newspaper?
Absolutely. That was the whole point. It looks like news, it smells like news, but it's fundamentally biased.
Right. So all thresholds have been met. What's the outcome under the new system?
The regulator steps in.
The regulator steps in during the election. They could order a mandatory disclosure to be printed on the front page. They could order a retraction of the grading table. They could issue a notice saying the material's not independent. They have options to correct the information environment before people vote.
And that changes the whole ballgame. If I see a big warning label on that newspaper that says, this ranking is from a publication owned by the candidate, I'm reading that table very, very differently.
Precisely. It preserves the freedom of speech. Don can still publish his paper, but it protects the integrity of the voter's information. It levels the playing field.
It seems so common sense. Why hasn't this happened yet? Why aren't these laws already on the books?
Because election law is slow to change. It's often highly political, and it reacts to problems after they become disasters. The Don Hill case is a warning sign. It's a flare going up in regional Victoria saying, hey, look at this giant hole in the fence.
And it's not just about one small town. That's what's so important here.
No. This is relevant to regional democracy everywhere, not just in Australia. As we see more media fragmentation, as local news gets hollowed out, this model, the local influencer running for office, is going to become the norm, not the exception.
That's the scary part, isn't it? We assume laws protect fairness. We assume that if something feels this wrong, it must be illegal. But often the law only protects technicalities.
That's the takeaway from this entire deep dive. In an era of media fragmentation, knowing who owns the news is just as important as reading the news itself. Transparency is the only disinfectant we have left.
It really makes you think. If a candidate can own the newspaper, grade their opponents a failure, take government advertising money, and do it all without breaking a single law, what else is currently legal that we just assume is banned?
That is the question, isn't it? And as media becomes more decentralized, as anyone can start a local news page on Facebook, are we going to see more barons of the local press running for office to grade their own papers?
I think we might. And until the laws catch up, it's on us, the voters, to be skeptical, to ask questions, and to always, always read the fine print.
Always read the fine print.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Really eye-opening.
My pleasure. It's a critical issue.
And thank you for listening to the deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one. Stay curious.